Well, good afternoon, everyone. I understood Akil was going to say a word or two, but I can go right ahead. No problem.
Yes, sorry. I was just looking for the notes. Yes. So
Yes.
our speaker for our devotional thought this morning is no stranger to us. It is Pastor Richard Roschman. He's currently the senior pastor at the Hamilton Mountain Seventh-day Adventist Church in Hamilton, Ontario. He has been a public campus minister, and he's been part of campus ministries. Um, for the last 20, 25 years, helping to have started many chapters in Ontario, including Cornerstone and Refuge when it was formerly called WASA, and even York ACF. And Pastor Roschman really loves the Lord, and he's a very intellectual young man who really likes engaging with students. And we know this because whenever you talk to him, you're always amazed at the different perspectives and ideas that he has to share. And so, another thing we would like to mention is that Pastor Roschman is the chaplain for ACF Ministries here in Ontario. So he is accessible to all our students, no matter what campus you attend, whether it's up at Laurentian, in Thunder Bay, in Sudbury, or down at St. Clair College in Windsor, Ontario. He's accessible to all of us. So without further ado, Pastor Roschman, you've got the floor.
Thanks, Akil. I like the part about young man. I appreciate that, even though I've been in campus ministries longer than you've been alive, I think. I don't know how old you are now, but see, I'm wearing, as I said earlier, I'm wearing this Muskoka Bear Wear sweatshirt in mourning for not being able to go to camp this winter. But what can you do? So instead, I'm in Ephesus, if you're wondering where that is. That is the theater where Paul was, where Paul went in, and he wanted to talk to the crowd there that was shouting and screaming for his blood and shouting out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." You remember that incident in the book of Acts? So yeah, I wish I was actually in Ephesus right now, but I'm not. I'm at home, of course. And but I'll share with you a story about Paul. But first of all, I want to tell you a story something that happened, a true story happened during World War II. That's 1939 to 1945 for those who don't know their history. And it concerns a US airplane in the Pacific War. And, their technology was much more primitive than now. They oftentimes planes would lose their way, splash down to the ocean, the crews would be lost. Well, what happened was that this US airplane was flying back to base after a mission. Weather was bad, it was running low on fuel, and it came to the point where it was actually out of fuel and it was just gliding, looking for somewhere to land. I mean, it was going to splash down in the water, they'd all be lost. There was 12 people on board, including an Army chaplain, or rather an Air Force chaplain. And they looked for a place to land. There was an island. They could see a grassy field at the edge of this island. So they said, well, we've got nowhere else to go. We don't know if there's enemy soldiers on the island. And so it was getting dark, and they managed to land without any fuel, silently, because the engines had stopped, and they just landed on this grassy field right at the edge of the ocean on this island. And so they, by now it was dark, getting very dark, or actually, the sun was just setting, so very little light left. So that what they did is they sent out scouts to see if there's anyone else on the island. As it turned out, there was a base on the other side of the island. There's hundreds of enemy soldiers there. And so if the Japanese had found them, they would be imprisoned at best, killed possibly as well. And so they just simply were wondering, now what do we do? We're stuck on an island. We have no fuel. We're outnumbered hundreds and hundreds to just the 12 of us here. What do we do? And so the captain of this airplane turned to the chaplain and he said, look, you believe there's a God out there, you believe in prayer, okay, now's the time to pray and really believe it, because we're in trouble. And so they began to, the chaplain led them in prayer, and he went out and he prayed, and they all tried to get some sleep. Well, of course, there was some, soldiers on watch, but they, as quiet as possible, they just hunkered down, waited for some light. to better assess their situation. During midnight, at midnight, the chaplain awoke suddenly. He awoke suddenly because it's like he heard a voice in his ear saying, "Go down to the shore." And so he woke up heart pounding. He went down to the shore, and at the shore there, he found there was a barge that had actually come to rest on the sand. And on the barge was a dozen barrels of high octane airplane fuel. And so he was stunned by this. He crept back and he told the captain this, woke him up and says, you never believe what's down there. They went down there, they grabbed a barrel of fuel or two, and they've filled up their plane with fuel. And as soon as it was light enough to see where they were going, just enough, they got back in the plane and they took off, and none was the wiser. Well, of course, as they went back to base, they were curious to know how on earth they had actually managed to, get fuel at a time like that. And so how did that barge get there? What do they do? So the inquiries were made, and it turns out that about 3,000 miles away, there was a cargo ship filled with fuel, and it was being shadowed by a German submarine. And so they decided to get some of the fuel off the ship and put it on barges, because if they put a torpedo into that, the ship would go up like a huge bomb, and that'd be the end of everybody. And so they took fuel off onto barges and towed it behind them. But during a storm, one of the cables broke and this barge went free. And this barge traveled 3,000 miles over a number of months to end up on that shore at that time, just in time to meet the requirements of that plane so it could get off the enemy island. And so, God had heard their prayers and answered their prayers even before they were in the situation. They were somewhere else. And so God timed it precisely exactly. So their prayers were answered exactly when they needed them to be answered. And they were rescued, and they were able to go back home. It's amazing how God works in situations like that. Before we call, he will answer is the text. Remember that? And so what they did was they had a service of thanksgiving for God's providential care in providing for them. Now, there's a text in Romans 8:28 that you probably know by heart. All things work together for the good of those that love God and are called according to his purposes. It does not say that all things are good. There's some really nasty things that happen in our lives in the world. This COVID thing is not good. Isolation is not good. But what it does say is all things work together for good for those who trust God and are called according to his purposes. In other words, you put yourself in God's hands, and he says, look, he will take whatever things happen to us and he'll bring good out of those circumstances. The devil throws something at us, and God takes that because we trust him with it. We hand it over to God and say, Lord, could you please do something with this mess? Could you do something with this tragedy, this problem? Because I cannot do it myself. I have no idea what to do with this. God takes the problems and situations and obstacles, and he brings good out of those things. All things work together for the good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes. God has a purpose. He has called us. We've given ourselves to him. We've invited him to take charge, take control, and he will bring good out of those circumstances. Okay? Now, let me just give you one more story here that illustrates that, because quite frankly, sometimes this does not mean that we are spared suffering, that we're spared problems, that we're spared disease. There's no guarantee of that in the Bible. Don't let anyone tell you that, well, if you're truly a Christian, you will avoid all problems. That's nonsense, of course. I mean, we face trouble and problems. We go through terrible things that we have no idea why God lets them happen to us. Okay? That's just the way life is. But God still promises that he will take those things and bring good out of them. And let me just finish here by looking at Acts chapter 16. In Acts chapter 16, you remember what happened was that Paul and others were going on their way, it says, to the place of prayer. This is Acts 16, verse 16. And they were met by a female slave who had the spirit by which he predicted the future, says my translation. Actually, the Greek says they were greeted by a woman who was possessed by a python spirit. And a python, that's a very strange expression. But they believed that there was this Python goddess who would give people the spirit of telling the future, connected to the oracle at Delphi. And so that was the name they gave to these people who could supposedly tell the future. They were also famous as ventriloquists, oddly enough. But the point is here, this one, they call it a Python spirit. She was possessed by this, and it truly was an evil spirit because she's falling behind Paul. And what is she saying? She's saying true things, you'll notice. These men are servants of the Most High God and telling you the way to be saved. Well, that sounds like a pretty good endorsement. But as it turns out, of course, servants of the Most High God could refer to Zeus or to anyone who is a high god over other gods. And so it was not giving credit to the God of the Bible, Yahweh, the God, the true God of Scripture. And so it was a very mixed endorsement, shall we say. And besides that, they didn't want an endorsement from an evil spirit. That's a very confusing message, and it gave credibility to this woman and the spirit that spoke through her. And so Paul turns around at one point, and he casts the demon out of her. The result of that was that her owners lost a large income, and so they laid charges against Paul. They started a riot. They got Paul arrested, beaten, thrown in prison. And these were nasty places. So he's in the stocks, in this hole in the ground, essentially. And he's there. And you remember the story, how he responded to the suffering he was going through. He began to sing. I don't know if that would be my first instinct, but he's there, naked and bleeding, beaten terribly, locked in stocks, in the dark, cold. And I guess you try to keep warm by doing what you can do. And so he sang. I don't know how you sing when your feet or your arms are stuck to these holes and you're locked over in a very uncomfortable position. Their job was not to make you comfortable, to make you suffer, teach you a lesson. And so they were singing. Now, I want you to notice what happened here. It says at midnight, the same time as my last story, by the way. At midnight, God answered their songs of praise, which were actually a way of reaching out to God in faith in trouble. And the doors flung open. There was an earthquake, it says. The doors flung open. The chains fell off their hands and feet. And the ruler of the prison was about to kill himself, because in those days, if a prisoner escaped, you were put to death. If you were in charge of them, you died. So that kind of made bribery unattractive. Okay? You don't accept a bribe. It means you're going to die at the end of it anyways. And so he's about to kill himself, and Paul knows this, and so he calls out to the captain of the jail, we're all alive, we're still here, we're doing fine. And so he rushes in and kneels down before Paul, says, what must I do to be saved? You know the story. At the end of this, the captain of the guard there takes him to his home next door, his house, and washes their wounds. He bandages them up, clothes them, and gives them a hot meal. And they sit there together and talk. And it says at the end of that night, the whole household, that means all the servants, slaves, everyone in that household, the whole household was baptized in the name of Jesus. Now, was it a good thing that he was beaten? Was it that they were unjustly treated, even against the law, because he was a Roman citizen, so they acted against the law in doing so? Was it a good thing? Of course not. Was it painful? Obviously, it was horrible. And yet God took the bad things that happened to them and brought good things out of them. A whole household. So Satan just tried to destroy their mission to the people there. God turned that around and used it to convert a whole household of people for Christ. Wasn't comfortable, obviously, very difficult. But God took what Satan threw at them and brought good out of it. And this is the way it is. If we place ourselves each day in God's hands and we say, Lord, whatever happens today, I'm okay with, use it for your glory, turn it around some way and use it for good, God will do that. And he's, by his providential power, he will take whatever happens to us, whatever messes we make in our lives, God will take that and bring glory out of it if we allow him. So whatever we're going through right now, whatever troubles, difficulties, because of this pandemic or anything else, in our time of isolation, take time daily to recommit yourself to Christ, to give your days over to him, to give him whatever messes you're in, whatever obstacles you're facing, and say, Lord, I'm claiming that promise. Bring good out of this situation, and he will do so. I guess I pass it back to Victoria here now. who's taking over. There we go.